touch each other, please. They go right down deep, and they have collided. So both the BWT cars collide.
So into Nissan squabble between the two Williams. Looks to me like Rosberg tapped the back of Webber. That is absolutely the last thing any Formula One team wants to see.
That's a Lacey and Heidfeld. I don't know what's happened, but it's poor Alain Prost, as if he hadn't got enough pressure on him.
Oh, we've lost a wheel. It's a racing engineering car that's ripped his left wheel off. Furious at his teammate. That will be a very fun team briefing.
Hello there, and welcome to Teammate Collision, the Grand Prix Rejects podcast, hosted by myself, Jeremy, and my wonderful colleague, Lennart.
As always, it is a very big pleasure to be here, so let's get down to business.
Yes, it is a bit of a heat wave here in Europe, but in this sweltering summer of 2023, we are taking a trip back to the golden age of Formula One. That's right, the year 2009.
What a wonderful time it was.
I appreciate your distant sarcasm there, Leonard. But anyone who knows either Leonard or I know that we have quite strong opinions on Jenson Button and Rubens Barrichello. We even did a podcast episode a few episodes ago about the two when they were teammates. So we thought, why don't we do a season review of the 1 year where both of them were fighting for the championship and talk about neither of them.
Indeed, we have instituted a top team driver ban. In that we are not going to talk about any of the drivers who were still in contention for the World Championship at the Brazilian Grand Prix. Which
that phrase top team driver sadly excludes Mark Webber, which feels like we're being very harsh to the Australian.
So we are obviously going to talk about his first win, so I think he will forgive us. In the very unlikely case he listened to us.
Yes,
Hi, Mark.
I suppose in a backwards way we are complimenting him by talking about him. But the main reason why we're not talking about Barrichello, we're not talking about Button, and we're not talking about Vettel, the reason is because we've spoken about them in previous episodes. We talked about Barrichello and Brawn as teammates, and we've also had the very silly Vettel situations where we discussed perhaps more the low points as well as the high points. More the low points of Sebastian Vettel's career, which often occurred in the year 2009. So, rather than treading on our toes and repeating ourselves, we shall begin from... I'm not sure where we'll begin. We haven't actually decided that, Leonard. You're usually good with organising these things. How shall we discuss 2009?
Well, to provide a contrast to the 2003 podcast, we are going to not go down the World Drivers' Championship standing, but instead look at the Constructors' standings, which in 2003 we actually did not do at all.
Okay.
And obviously, because the bottom is much more interesting to us, we are going to start at the quote-unquote top, with the third place team in the Constructors' Championship, which by a single point is McLaren Mercedes.
Yes, by a single point, because they spent most of the season in about 5th place or so, before they finally got their act together after the summer break. From about the German Grand Prix onwards, they finally got cars working in at least one of their cars, or at least that's what you would think, considering the pace of one of their cars compared to the other. But it's more of an indictment of a certain Finnish driver, not named Kimi Räikkönen, but actually named Heikki Kovalainen that year.
Never heard of him.
No. McLaren took 3rd place by a point. It was a really good late season revival, which really masks just how bad they were in, should I say, basically everything pre-Germany that year. In Germany, Hamilton famously got himself up into first at the first corner and then got basically bumped himself off and then spent the rest of the race in last. But the first 7 or 8 races of 2009, they were nowhere. And I guess it brings us to one of the main discussion talking points of 2009, which was the CARES device.
Yeah, the kinetic energy recovery system for long. One of the many technical rule changes of the season, and arguably the one that influenced many aspects of how the season developed and in fact how the previous season played out. We'll get there when we talk about a certain manufacturer team. And yeah, it is one of the more fascinating developments. To very oversimplify the technical concept for those who don't remember it, the curse system, which is actually redundant, uses kinetic energy created by the brakes to fuel an additional electrical motor, which enhances the performance of the car, obviously mostly in a straight line. And yeah, it, as I said, changed a lot of approaches for teams heading into the season, even their development plans throughout the 2008 season, simply because it was a project very adored by manufacturers because
they had the money for it.
Because they had the money for it, and they expected the few remaining privateers to not have the money for it, and more importantly, it just helped pushing the narrative both of Formula One as a peak of technological development, which was struggling a bit at the time outside of the aerodynamics department, and it also was a precursor to the greenwashing we see today, in that, yeah, we use our kinetic energy for energy management, to reuse this energy to help us be more efficient with our Formula One monstrosities of technology.
Yeah. Yes. It was something which it's probably one of the last things when my partner, for example, asks me, like, what relevance does F1 have for like actual normal cars, which is something she has asked me. Like, I always think of KERS, even though it's somewhat outdated now. But the idea was there. It's something which actually has been for over a decade now, basically implemented in regular road cars, that braking builds up energy, which is then put into the rest of the power of the car. That's the very dumb 5-year-old explanation for it, but like, saves power. The only problem is it weighs a lot. Most of the manufacturers spent a huge amount of money investing in this. The main problem was the weight of it, and the actual cost to benefit ratio of the weight compared to the amount of energy stored up and therefore power gained from having the KERS was, it took them almost a half of the season to get it to actually work, which meant that you had teams like McLaren who had spent millions of dollars on this fantastic new device, which had them finishing races not even in the points.
Let alone on the lead lap.
Yes, exactly. KERS was an interesting thing because most of the seasons that we have discussed, to be honest, have had some kind of equality or parity between the teams, which is what makes them interesting to talk about. But 2009 was especially one of the seasons which had a very large set of rule changes going into it. The cars looked very, very different, and probably very different to the year before, and might be seen as the beginning of the current generation of cars which have developed from that sort of general shape. And McLaren got it wrong. However, they were the best of the teams that got it wrong.
Because that indeed leads us directly to the second team that had KERS issues and kind of got their design wrong. Fourth placed Ferrari.
Ferrari got no points from the first 3 races of the season. They were a disaster, even when they were getting their speed up, which I would say they were probably the first team to actually get their act together regarding KERS. But that didn't stop them basically floundering around in the midfield, specifically with one driver in particular. And when they did get themselves sorted out, their lead driver sadly was heavily injured in a qualifying accident. Felipe Massa got hit in the head during the Hungarian Grand Prix qualifying, and it knocked him out for the rest of the season, which meant that their second best driver, Kimi Räikkönen, had to basically take up the mantle just when the team got good. So Ferrari are interesting because they lost third place by a point, and both Ferrari and McLaren were basically operating as one car teams for quite a huge portion of the season. And it's interesting that both of them kind of ended up in that situation as the world champion, the world's drivers champion, and the world constructors champion fighting it out over scraps for a huge amount of the season. And 2009, although we see it in hindsight as perhaps not the most exciting year in terms of racing, the results on the scoreboard look absolutely fascinating when you put them in context of anything before it.
Yeah, one of the tragedies, as you mentioned, was of course Felipe Massa's injury, and it cannot be overstated that he was their number one driver that at that period in time, not only just because of his 2008 season, but in particular in the last races before his accident, when Ferrari was starting to get their stuff together. He was completely outperforming Raikkonen. He was ahead of him in most of the last 6 races before that, all the way dating back to Spain, where Massa was in the top 5 on the grid and Raikkonen did not even make it out of Q1. So, yeah, that was obviously a big game changer in the negative sense, which left them forced to rely on Luca Badoer after, well, the originally planned Michael Schumacher comeback didn't work out because he injured himself motorcycling. Genius that he was in that regard.
He wasn't the first and he wasn't the last, let's say that.
Yeah, let's say that. The thing is, and then after 2 races they aborted that experiment, brought in Giancarlo Fisichella off his podium in Spa. Didn't work out either. So, yeah, it's a shame in a way because with Massa they would have clearly beaten McLaren. I don't think there's much to discuss on that level. So, but you told me before that you had memories or have looked up some of the potential replacements that weren't Schumacher, and you promised they would be very interesting, so let's hear it.
Well, some of them are absolutely absurd. So the whole thing about Michael Schumacher not coming back to Ferrari was, the funny thing was that it was announced basically by his, was it Willy Weber was the name? Oh, who am I thinking of? It was...
I think at the time he was already no longer with Weber, but with his current manager, Miss Schmitz, I think is her name.
His manager at the time basically put up a big interview because there was so much talk about it. And he or she said that, hey, look, he's been injured and he is not coming back to Formula One. And all the gutter press basically published this interview as Michael Schumacher is coming back to Formula One. They basically just removed the not part and then just published it as fact. And so Michael, it was absolute nonsense. He was never in a position that he was coming back. And when you have that level of gutter press kind of reporting and getting read, you had all sorts of names. Sebastian Loeb was one, the World Rally Champion. We'll get back to him later, funnily enough, as a discussion topic. But yeah, Sebastian Loeb was one of the drivers, as well as one other Italian driver called Valentino Rossi, who was also apparently, according to unconfirmed sources, one of the main attractions for Ferrari to go there. But just about everyone, to their grandmother, to Jacques Villeneuve or whoever, was basically linked to that seat after Massa. After Massa's accident, because it was such a hot seat, because Ferrari were seen at that point as, hey, look, like this is the team that's going to come back and win races.
Also because it's Ferrari.
And also because it's Ferrari.
I quickly need to correct myself. Actually, Willy Weber was still his manager at the time, so your first, I don't want to say guess, your first information was actually correct, so that was a mistake on my part. And secondly, to the Rossi's thing. Apparently, or well, not apparently, but he did test the Ferrari back in 2007 or 2008, and according
he tested it multiple times.
And according to the sources at the time, he was actually not that slow in it. So who knows?
It's something which might seem bizarre now, but Rossi did multiple times flirt with the idea of switching over to Formula One, because he was basically the almost undefeated world motorcycle champion in various disciplines, and he was a hot prospect, but he was the kind of person who, just the same as any potential IndyCar driver coming to Formula One, like he wasn't gonna again we can get into that in a second, but he wasn't going to come to Formula One in a bottom team. And I think the real crazy thing about Felipe Massa's seat is, do you know how many points he got, or that seat got, after he had his accident? For the rest of the season, for the following 7 races, how many points did anyone get in that seat?
Wasn't that a big fat 0?
Yes, it was. Ferrari was genuinely operating a one-car team for the last 7 races of the year. And it's a testament to how difficult the car was to drive. And it's also a testament, perhaps, just to how good Massa was, and especially before his accident. Maybe this might be a little bit of a segue, but I think one of the main talking points of 2009 is Felipe Massa's crash, about heavy crashes in general and how they affect driver performance. Although it might be easy to make a conclusion about crashes and how they affect performance, maybe the romantic in me thinks that there is actually a link there. And I'm generally of the opinion that Massa was not the same after his crash.
Yeah, and the thing is, with that type, there seem to be 2 kinds of drivers when it comes to that. There are drivers who can shake it off. The obvious prime example being aforementioned Michael Schumacher, who won 5 world championships in a row after breaking his leg in 1999. And then there are some drivers who don't, like Felipe Massa. So obviously, in hindsight especially, actually let me rephrase that, especially with the memories of the time, it is of course tragic that he, in a way, got robbed of what his career could have been had he stayed at that pre-injury level, given that his accident was a couple of weeks removed from the regrettable death of Henry Surtees at a Formula 2 race in an eerily similar way. Both were hit by flying parts, so in Surtees' case it was actually a tire, whereas Massa was hit by a spring coming off the brawn. So, yeah, at the time we were, of course, just lucky to still have Massa around. But obviously, as you said, it's an accident that changed Massa forever as a driver, and of course it's just a sporting tragedy, so to speak. But
yeah, without getting too grim, I guess it's just the point that, like, they always say that, like, what makes the best drivers the best is the fact that they have that extra tenth, that they will pull the foot down to the floor round the most dangerous corner, and they'll do it. And I've heard this said about, funnily enough, Valentino Rossi himself when he broke his own leg back in 2010, I think it was, where it took him many years to get himself back, so to speak, to his best. He did back in sort of the mid to late 2010s. He did have a sort of a renaissance period, but he did also have a period whereby he was slower. He didn't have the edge, and maybe I'm inserting a narrative there which doesn't exist. But I don't want to be too grim or too depressing in this early in the podcast. But I think 2009 is the last great season of Felipe Massa, and it's a big shame because not only did he have a title taken away from him, so to speak, 1 point on the last lap, but he also had the 2009 glory taken away from him 1 race, basically the race that Ferrari got good. Both times are quite tragic, because Felipe Massa has always been a very lovely guy, and I think he was always one of the most popular people in the pit lane because he was such a generally nice person to be around. And so, yeah, not to get too depressing, but that's how I will remember 2009 in many ways.
No, it is a reasonable way to look at things. In the end, we just cannot escape the fact that our sport has an inherent level of danger. I mean, in a way, many sports have. Compare the injury list of a Formula 1 season to, say, I don't know, an NBA season or any soccer season. We are going to end up with a much shorter list. So it's not unfair to let injuries, in a way and in a part, define a Formula 1 season. So But I do agree, we do want to stay cheerful, and what does provide more cheer than a team starting off right and then completely blowing it in terms of development? We are at the 5th place of the championship, Toyota.
When you say starting off right, are you talking back in 2001, 2002, or when? When did they start it off right?
Actually, I meant within the season. In their first 4 races, they did score a tremendous amount of points, 2 podiums. Then came absolutely nothing. Then they stumbled into 2 podiums at Singapore and Japan, God knows how. And then again came absolutely nothing.
Yes. Toyota scored some points at the beginning of the season. However, it is reckoned that they had the second fastest car on pace for the beginning of the season, which makes it all the more damning that they never, not that they never won a race, they never got close to winning a race. They were never there. Okay, this is where we get into the nonsense already. But so, the Bahrain Grand Prix, Toyota got a 1-2 on the grid, and it turned out that they basically had not just like a couple, but something like 10, 12 laps less fuel than the bronze behind them. So Jenson Button was sitting in 3rd on the grid. If I remember, he was 3rd on the grid with basically 10 laps or so more of fuel than Timo Glock, who was on 2nd. So Timo Glock had about 5 laps less than Jarno Trulli did, who had about 12 laps of fuel, and he was slower than him. So you had a team which had a genuinely fast car and had the world's worst possible strategist team. Whoever those people are, I hope they're not still working in Formula 1. But maybe Ferrari bought them. Maybe that's...
You just know they are still working in Formula 1, and
yeah.
Ferrari seem like as good a guess as any.
Or Alfa Romeo, perhaps. So maybe that's dating our podcast a tiny bit. But
both
yeah.
Not that far away from Cologne, but so it's not off the table.
Coincidence? I think not. So Ferrari, Toyota. So the thought of anger and frustration makes me think of Ferrari, but no, Toyota is what we're talking about, and they
both have red on their car.
A better chance than any other season probably to actually do something. If I remember correctly, they were also one of the 3 teams which had some version of the famous double diffuser, which Braun was using. I think Williams was the other.
Yes.
And they didn't do anything with it. They got a couple of podiums. The Jarno Trulli one was on. The Jarno Trulli podium was gained from an incident. He had it, and then he lost it, and then he had it again. So you
the infamous Liegate.
Yeah, you could almost give Jarno Trulli half a podium for that race. And goodness, where do you even begin and where do you end with Toyota? They were, it showed them up perfectly. If they weren't going to win in 2009, they were never going to win.
And they never won.
And they never did, yeah.
Yeah, the fact that I'm stuttering out this point actually makes my point for me better than I could. Toyota, we all know Toyota as a Formula 1 team as a whole. The wasted money, let's not say wasted, because obviously competing in Formula 1 is still a valuable endeavor. Hi Pro Drive. Hi David Richards, don't think I've forgotten about you. But the unsuccessful use of money, let's put it that way. Throughout the entire history as a team, and 2009 is the absolute flawless microcosm of that. The great money resulted in a great concept, but an execution that was okay at the start, but then completely fell off. And, well, it left both of their drivers at the then new 2010 teams, and of course, it didn't even give us the wonderful story of Stefan GP, but that's for the 2010 podcast we will most certainly do eventually.
Yes. I'll agree to 2010.
Yeah, all in all, a big load of disappointment. Toyota Formula 1.
And speaking of a big load of disappointment and not winning, who's in 6th place?
That would be BMW Sauber.
Wow, BMW Sauber. You mean the team that spent the most money on cars? The team that was the worst at using cars? The team that's decided after Robert Kubica's win that they would focus all their money and all their attention on 2009?
That very BMW Sauber.
So you're trying to tell me that they finished behind Toyota?
Indeed they did.
Oh dear. Speaking of endless misery, Nick Heidfeld was a very solid and dependable driver. He did a decent job in a terrible car, which did not how should I say, flourish in the new regulations. Robert Kubica was nowhere to be seen for extensive portions of the season. I think he was sort of more traumatized and going to see his therapist for most midweek times, considering his opportunities the previous year. But that's one for a 2008 review, which we're definitely doing. BMW Sauber farted their way out of the sport after 3 really, really good years, where they just got better and better and better, and then they came out with a really ugly, boring car, had 1.5 drivers, and yeah, they kind of farted their way out of the sport, and Kubica didn't turn up until the last 4 or 5 races. Heidfeld lost his finishing streak towards the end of it, and they must be the most unspecial team aside from what other. They must be the second most unspecial team of 2009, because they weren't interesting, they weren't successful, they weren't motivated, and then they left.
Yeah, and in a way, that is an almost Greek tragedy-esque story, because contrary to Toyota, you kind of linked them with your comment, BMW were the exact opposite. They came in, bought an established team, didn't start from scratch, so to speak. They got better, both within the season and within seasons, plural. They started out good in 2006, got very good in 2007, and were technically second in the championship, but thanks for Spygate, and then made the jump to race winners in 2008. It was all a perfectly natural progression as far as Formula One teams is concerned.
It was all going so well.
Yeah, if you write a how-to on a manufacturer joining Formula One, that is how you'd write it. Start off okay, get better, win races. And then, just based on one decision, based on one false investment into a technology that didn't work out for them, it all fell apart. And of course, thanks to the economic crisis, which was the omnipresent theme at the time. And is again. What a lovely word. So much for being depressing. Anyway.
It's like poetry, it rhymes.
Yeah, and that is why not only the decision to abandon the 2008 development, but just the entire concept of going all in for 2009 and coming up so short, it's as I said, it's like a Greek tragedy, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't have much more to say about Sauber except for maybe the performances of their drivers, but they were a background team, and they went from being one of the more exciting prospects of the year to basically, you can't really call them a laughing stock because they just didn't do anything very interesting to laugh at.
Yeah. Again, they were a tragedy, not a comedy. But speaking of BMW, and since we already had the topic of one driver teams, so we are going to get both of those in a way, because BMW's former business associates, so to speak, are next in the standings, and that would be Williams.
Indeed. Williams, I just want to make a point. So people have been listening to this so far. It might sound like we're being overly critical on teams that finished like 3rd, 4th, 5th and 6th in the championship. But funnily enough, it's like most of the teams have a heavy amount of indictment that you can throw on them, except for the top 2, who we just decided not to talk about. So it's,
and if we wanted to, we could talk a lot of smack about them as well.
Yeah, they weren't perfect either. But it's. I just want to make a point clear that like 2009 was a season where just about everyone made major screw-ups, either on a conceptual level in terms of how they developed their car, on a logistical level about how they actually did their race strategies, for example. Everyone succeeded, but almost everybody failed in some very major way. Williams failed in the way that they forgot to hire a second driver, which tends to make it harder to score points.
Oh, that's harsh. But not incorrect.
Nico Rosberg was great. It's no surprise that he got a better seat after 2009 because while he, like another driver, was basically carrying his team, he was, well, I don't really know what more to say. He had a, if you imagine, the thing about Rosberg is that there are many points, positions, possibilities that he lost as well. Singapore is the most famous one, where he bundled himself over the pit exit line, where he could have finished something like third or fourth again, and he was the king of finishing fourth, fifth or sixth and just collecting the points, doing well. I think he was even literally up to somewhere like fourth or fifth in the championship by the summer break, and he was a very decent and dependable driver. Only problem was that Williams only had one driver that year, so they finished much further back probably than they deserved to be. At least they really shouldn't have finished the season behind BMW, considering what BMW was up to.
And in a way, that is a not a reflection, that's the wrong word. It mirrors BMW's situation in one specific way, in that they had something good in 2008 and it just completely fell apart. The thing is, Kazuki Nakajima, he ended up being a Formula 1 reject and he ended up out of the sport after this season, and rightfully so, it must be said. But his 2008 was good. Yeah. Obviously it wasn't Nico Rosberg good, but it was good.
It was dependable, yeah.
There was nothing there that would make you expect that if Williams had a competent car, if Williams were good, if they had found the trick of the double diffuser, that Nakajima would not score a single solitary point all year. There was nothing there. Nothing to expect such a, meltdown, really.
Yeah, and it might also be there's a difference as well between Nakajima having a meltdown and, I can't mention his name, but a certain Brazilian, for example, whining to the media, for example. Like, the thing about Nakajima as well is perhaps the language barrier makes a somewhat, maybe I'm just making stuff up, but what I find interesting about Nakajima, I guess the point I'm trying to make, is that his failure was also relatively quiet. He didn't have the spotlight of the world honing in on him at all, as far as I recall. I don't remember there being a heavy amount of criticism towards Nakajima during the season, or at least from any kind of the major press outlets which might try to, stoke the flames, get him replaced, for example. There wasn't really a huge amount of that. And he kind of just quietly went about his way, not scoring points. And it's a bit almost bizarre, because Rosberg was something of the under the radar driver. He almost emulates Ralf Schumacher 10 years previously, who also was a very, very dependable driver for Williams, and his teammate also scored no points in Alex Zanardi. And it's a funny sort of repeat of history. But yeah, it's interesting that Nakajima's fall from grace was just sort of not ignored, so to speak, but it was just so unspecial and uninteresting to the press. Again, perhaps his background, perhaps the fact that he was, well, if I'm not mistaken, was he not Toyota's man?
Yeah, he was pretty much placed there by Toyota after Woods decided to call it a career. And I guess that's one way. And of course, there is this certain cliche of the Japanese driver that we have, where they tend to be fast but always ready to do something dumb, and in many ways, while Nakajima was exactly not that, it also wasn't seen as particularly surprising that he would not score a single point. If we remember, Takuma Sato did the very same thing in 2005 after a pretty good 2004. So yeah, I guess because those memories were fresh, it was just filed as, Japanese corporate driver does not good. who cares? Perhaps that was the reasoning, but that's just as much speculation as.
No, but it's a good point. Like, so many Japanese drivers were there because of the engine supplier, perhaps. And I just want to say for the record that Takuma Sato did actually get 1 point in 2005, and that should.
Oh, I forgot Hungary. God damn it.
But yeah, no worries.
Even though, how can I forget Ra's first podium for Toyota? What a shame. And I call myself a Formula One. Well, I don't call myself a Formula One expert. Do I? If I don't, I should.
I was about to say, if you don't know, one else will.
No. Anyway,
Eighth on the list.
Speaking of works failures, neither Toyota, nor BMW, nor Ferrari were the worst works team of 2009. That distinct honor goes to the ING Renault Formula One team, as it was known for the first part of the season.
I was going to say, or later as it was known, Renault Formula One team. But yeah, speaking of one-car teams, speaking of manufacturers who got everything wrong, speaking of misery and slowness, and yeah, Renault. We had Fernando Alonso, who was doing his, so to speak, penance in purgatory after his McLaren fallout, waiting for Ferrari to hire him. He drove around, got a couple of decent finishes in a bit of a crappy car, famously out qualifying Nelson Piquet Jr. just about more than any other performance in history in terms of qualifying difference, and that includes Nelson Piquet's teammates.
In that, we can give a shout out to one of our Discord users who has invented a statistics called the Nelson, where he measures whenever a driver advances to Q3 when his teammate does not even get out of Q1. And obviously, as the name implies, it's very much an honor, quote unquote, to Nelson Piquet Jr., who did manage to get Nelson very, very often.
Do we talk about the elephant in the room regarding Renault?
We certainly have to.
Okay. So the most interesting thing in the entirety of the 2009 season, I'm not talking about just for Renault, I'm talking about the most interesting thing that happened in 2009 happened in 2008, which was when a certain Nelson Piquet Jr., who you may have heard of, drove into turn 14, I think it was, the old Singapore Grand Prix layout, thus bringing out a safety car. Flashback again, the German Grand Prix that year, a well-timed safety car had just got Nelson Piquet Jr. a surprise podium, which he absolutely didn't deserve. But he got anyway, so good job. Hats off to him. And it made the Renault team very, very happy. And,
as podiums are want to do.
Yes. And they realised that they could do this at potential opportune moments, such as when Fernando Alonso, outside runner for pole, fluffed off his lap, if I'm not mistaken. Or no, he had a
I think it was a technical issue, yeah.
Yeah, it was a technical issue and was out, I think, something like 15th on the grid. And what do you know, a well-timed safety car bumped him all the way up to the front of the grid, and he won the race. And this was discovered somewhere just after the summer break. Funnily enough, basically at the Singapore Grand Prix of 2009, ING pulled out. It turned out that Flavio Briatore and Nelson Piquet Jr. had, and Pat Simmons had orchestrated a cheat. They had cheated the previous season, and they were all duly fired. Nelson Piquet Jr. got immunity to confess, and just about most of the main personnel who were involved all got fired, noticeably not Fernando Alonso, who stayed on to the end of the season.
And I, for one, do not believe for a single second he did not know. Just for the record.
Yeah. Fernando Alonso, although I do very much like him since he moved to... I was going to say since after he got stuck behind Petrov, I grew to like him because it was nice to see Fernando Alonso not winning stuff. But in the late 2000s, he had perhaps might one call it an attitude problem. Famously, the Nürburgring race of 2007, where he was wagging his finger at the camera and
the Hungary pit stop
The
well, not
Hungarian
pit stop, but
stop,
the
yeah.
Hungary pit debacle.
That too. And I'm thinking especially of the 2009 season, whereby he had basically been implicitly contained within a cheating scandal, proceeded to put his Renault on the podium and dedicate his podium to the press as dedicated to Flavio Briatore, his mentor and hero.
What a dickhead.
Controversial Fernando sticking his neck out on the line once again. But Alonso was a person who was difficult to like, I would say, in terms of the way he pushed himself out to the press. He was very, very fast, but it was his being taken down a few notches was very well deserved back in those days. This was all a very, very long-winded way of saying Renault sucked, and then their year got worse when it turned out that they cheated, and then they lost all their staff and all their drivers.
So, of course, the thing is, you tell your number 2 driver to intentionally crash, which I don't condone, I want to stress that, and then you fire him less than 8 months after the fact. That is actually the dumbest thing in this whole endeavor. Like, you know this dude has you by the metaphorical balls. This dude knows exactly what you did, and you just fire him?
You have to think about this. Obviously, people don't just make these decisions on a whim. They sat down in a room, and Flavio Briatore and Pat Simmons decided it would be better to take the risk and fire Nelson Piquet Jr. than have him drive for the team for one more race.
And not only is that stupid, I mean, in the way, Piquet should have had a Renault contract for, well, at least Renault's life, which ended up being pretty short in comparison, but that's neither here nor there. But, most importantly, you then replace him not with some big name, some superstar, like, I don't know who was on the market at the time.
Kimi Räikkönen?
Yeah, Kimi Räikkönen, or even an actual big name like Valentino Rossi, who gets you the eyes, who gets you the attention. You bring in Romain Grosjean, and I want to stress that I respect Romain Grosjean as a driver very much, and in many ways he got the short end of the stick with his short-term debut, which in a way damaged his reputation in the sport, really, and left him on the shelf until 2012 again. But it's just insane to just replace a admittedly not good driver with a complete rookie, when that complete rookie is, again, very raw, very young, very error prone, and when the not good established driver has such a secret over you. Were they hoping that he wouldn't spill the beans because he himself would be banned? Then that might be a fair reasoning, but then we remember that is Nelson Piquet's son, and we all know Nelson Piquet was, at the best of times, very petty.
Yeah.
So, it's just absolutely insane.
Yeah, the whole family have a very stinky attitude towards most things. Nelson Piquet Jr. was not a very nice person either. It's just a whole bunch of people who all basically got what they deserved. Nelson Piquet Jr. was never seen again. Unfortunately, he was seen again in Formula E, but I don't want to talk about that.
Unlike Renault, he has won a world championship out of it. Jesus Christ!
I want to get the trauma of Nelson Piquet Jr.'s handed Formula E season out of my brain, but yeah, a bunch of not very nice people screwed themselves over, and then they all got fired. So, I mean, all's well that ends well when you think about it.
Well, yeah, all is well that ends well. To paraphrase a famous wrestling saying, Flavio screwed Flavio.
Dishonorable mention I want to say as well to two things. One of which is that in practice for the Singapore Grand Prix in 2009, Romain Grosjean crashed in the exact same corner in the exact same way that Nelson Piquet Jr. had the previous year in the race. A more serious dishonorable mention goes to the other drivers. Crashgate itself is worthy of a Reject of the Year podium. Not that we're getting to it now, but one thing which is always dishonorable, in my opinion, whenever any big scandal comes to light, is when people try to somehow make some kind of one-upsmanship on "I knew all along." They are the worst people.
Yes.
I like Nick Heidfeld, for example. I think he's a very boring but very dependable guy who was very talented in Formula One. However, I have no time for people like him who turn around into the BBC who say, "Oh yes, after the Grand Prix, we all thought that there was something up." And it's like, well, I call that, first of all, bullshit. And second of all, you're a wanker if you knew this stuff was happening and you didn't do anything about it, kind of thing. It's like, it reeks of some sort of moral grandstanding, which you don't need to do. It would honestly be better and more tasteful if you just went, "What? I didn't know that. What a surprise!" You know, it would be more honest, at least,
and more believable. Because my first reaction, I did not remember that part of the story, and when you told me, my first instinct, and I think that may even be on the recording, is I said, "Cool story, Nick."
Yeah. I don't believe for a second that Nick Heidfeld was in any way in any kind of knowledge about what was going on, or at least even if he had suspicion, it would have been that at most. And it's I don't like that kind of talk.
Yeah, it's very intellectually lazy.
But shall we move on?
So of course there's one exception if you leave evidence, so to speak, of it. If there's like something where you said something was fishy at the time or have it written down somewhere. If you have that, fine. Gloat by all means. So just so we don't want to be like we discourage gloating on principle.
No, we never gloat.
And from a team that did very poorly with good resources, we go to a team that did well with poor resources. Force India.
Force India is a bit of a I don't want to say an icon because it wasn't that important, but there's something about the sight of Vijay Mallya on the pit wall when you watch an old F1 race that to me it has the same sort of vibe as seeing Martin Whitmarsh and many of these other big name people who have come and gone from Formula One. And Vijay Mallya poured a big pile of money from, was it Kingfisher Airlines back in the day, into his Formula One team, and they had, if I'm not mistaken, a Mercedes engine, which meant that they were very, very good in a straight line. However, it didn't help them a huge amount because it took them a while to develop their car, except for two particular races.
Spa and Monza.
Yes. They came out of the summer break and took pole position at the Belgian Grand Prix. And almost pole position, we'll get to this, almost pole position at the Italian Grand Prix. Would you like to tell the story?
Well, I certainly can do that. And the story is pretty simple. Because they both had the powerful Mercedes-Benz engine and had developed their car with brake line speed in mind, they obviously were in a position to take advantage of these high-speed circuits and ended up getting a pole through Giancarlo Fisichella at the Belgian Grand Prix. Though, unfortunately, the very same technology that has doomed most of the teams that we mentioned before, especially the works teams, the very same technology came back to haunt one of the teams that didn't have it. And that technology would be Curse. Mm-hmm. After an early safety car caused by a crash involving an unnamed title contender and Lewis Hamilton and two other cars I do not remember, the safety car came out, and after that safety car period, Fisichella was left as a sitting duck for Kimi Räikkönen because Räikkönen had cars and Fisichella did not. And after that, it just proved impossible to pass Räikkönen again because, again, Kerr's advantage. Even though Fisichella was otherwise very competitive, and so it was left with only P2, which was the former John's team second place since a long time.
Yeah, ages.
And so they were left to try again at Monza, but regrettably it was a simple case of the bronze finally working again those unmentionable bronze.
And Force India
And-
sadly being in the hands of Adrian Sutil, who was not Giancarlo Fisichella.
And its new teammate, Antonio Luzzi, because Fisichella obviously could not resist the offer to go to Ferrari ahead of the Italian Grand Prix. So, and given as he got a GT Works career out of it after what was the last season of his Formula 1 career, I'd say it was a wise choice in the end.
Yeah, all's well that ends well again. Yeah. Just for context, is what Lennart was saying. If you don't know how CARES works, basically it's like you use it over the course of a lap. So every lap it regenerates and you can use it again. So what was happening was that Raikkonen used it as a push to pass over Fisichella, and although Fisichella had faster straight line speed, Raikkonen could always use his CARES on the straight, which basically negated Fisichella's advantage. Just wanted that for context. But,
So, the tale of Force India 2009 is a very interesting one, especially if we look at the backmarkers of today. See, one of the inherent traits of many of the new tracks coming into Formula 1, talking Las Vegas here, obviously, well, Baku isn't new anymore, but you get the point, is they are comparatively fast circuits, especially by the standard of street circuits. And now I am left to ponder whether a team should look into a team at the back, like say Williams, or whether they should look into imitating that design to just straight up abandon any hope at low speed circuits like Monaco and or Budapest and just go straight up maximum top speed. Everything else does not exist. If you want to talk about grip and corners, go talk to someone else. We are not listening. To, at the very least, get a couple of points out of those races and then use the money earned with the comparatively higher championship position, even though it only got Force India 9th compared to 10th, but that's still a couple of $million.
yeah.
To launch themselves back into contention. But I guess team bosses know better than I do, so there's a reason they haven't done it, and if they do now, then they are welcome. I won't even charge them for this genius idea.
Yeah.
How generous.
Yeah, Force India are funny. They had a concept. It worked at the 2 circuits of the year where it worked. The rest of the year they were pretty anonymous. Fisichella basically was there when it mattered. Sutil was not as strong when he was needed, but he got some points as well. He unrejectified himself at Monza, and then they kind of faded into obscurity for the end of the year, and it was from 2010 onwards that they became pretty much a reliable midfielder team, 6th, 5th, 6th, 7th in the championship every year, and became what is now Aston Martin.
And again, it saved them from finishing last, which had been the finish of the former Jordan team in 2007 and in 2008, if we discount the part Super Aguri season, which we normally shouldn't, but for the sake of my argument, we will.
Yes. And who did finish in last in 2009?
That would be the last season of Toro Rosso as an actual customer team. So Scuderia Toro Rosso is and was 10th in 2009.
Funny fact, Toro Rosso were the only team who didn't get a pole, a fastest lap, or a podium. Every other team got at least one of those things. Even Williams got a fastest lap. In a
Wait.
season,
When did BMW get any of those?
BMW got 2 podiums.
Oh, yeah, podiums.
No worries.
It's too warm.
No worries. Toro Rosso never got higher than 7th. Their drivers were never really capable of anything more than that. Buemi was in his debut. He did very well against Sebastian Bourdais before Bourdais was fired and replaced by Jaume Alguersuari. Buemi had the measure of Alguersuari, who was 19 at the time, the youngest driver ever. With the exception of a bunch of double retirements, such as at Spain, Singapore again. I feel like we always talk about Singapore in this podcast, but Singapore especially as well, there was another double retirement I remember. They didn't really do a huge amount except for retire and hang around at the back. They were not really all that inspiring. Their main purpose as a junior team to Red Bull was somewhat, again, uninspiring because the main people they had were not exactly world beaters, and even in a season when things were very topsy-turvy and the actual pecking order changed in a way that you very rarely see these days. Even then, they were basically nowhere. They had a huge amount of technical failures, and their drivers just weren't up to scratch when it came to the moments when they could shine.
Yeah, they pretty much just existed, which again in a season, as you mentioned, as chaotic as 2009 is just not good enough when everyone can pull something out of their head at, well, any given time, so to speak. The worst thing is, in a way, as you mentioned, they mainly served as a Red Bull junior program, which kind of was the problem at the time. It was pretty clear after half the season that, yeah, there are no places opening at Red Bull anytime soon. Of course, back then we didn't know Mark Webber was talking to Ferrari about a move in 2011, but that's neither here nor there. And the thing is, you just know that the way that season was going and that Mark Webber and the unspeakable Red Bull driver would be at Red Bull for the foreseeable future. So, in a way, it made somewhat sense to replace Bourdais with the youngest driver of all time because neither of them were going anywhere fast. And Bourdais, in a way, was kind of quote-unquote broken by what happened in 2008. But, so yeah, replacing him made sense, but in the end, all it did, it was a very transitionary year for Toro Rosso, and yeah, that's not going to do in the 1 year where chaos exists and chaos equals opportunity, and not being able to take opportunities because you're in a transitional situation means you're going to finish last. And Toro Rosso deserved it, and they got it.
Yeah, I as you say, it's almost like the very bad timing, I suppose. If Bourdais had any hope or interest in driving fast, then they might have picked up a couple of good positions. But you can read our profile on the website. But Bourdais fell out of love with the team. He fell out of love with Formula One. He was hoping for some kind of sideways move, specifically preferably to Renault, which never happened, blocked by Briatore, and he had some very choice, miserable things to say about Monaco, for example. He called it like a car park and stuff like that to the media, like at the Grand Prix weekend. He just kind of seemed like he didn't. He had. Did
he actually say that?
Yep.
He came out of kart. They ran these kind of tracks all the goddamn time when he was there reigning perpetual champion. Like, come on, man.
Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but it seemed like Sebastian Bourdais didn't really want to be there.
Makes sense.
And, his teammate Buemi was also very young. Just fun fact, if you don't know this, they were in the 4 Red Bull seats. There were 3 Sebastians. There was Sebastian Vettel, Sebastian Bourdais, and Sebastian Buemi for the entire first half of 2009.
Zaptastic.
Yeah, Alguersuari and Buemi were in beginning years. Buemi did perfectly well. He beat Bourdais pretty significantly, and Alguersuari, as I said, and they would have a couple of good years together. But their firing is another story, and presumably for another profile. Actually, Buemi has a profile. One of our original profiles on our website is on Buemi, so you can actually look it up on our website if you're still interested.
To put some pressure on Jeremy, we are going to introduce and add links in the description, so feel free to read that.
Yes. Specifically to all of our profiles and all our things, because actually, funnily enough, 2009 has a lot of information which we've actually made in discussion articles on our forum. But I feel like, again, Lennart, unless you would like to push us in a certain direction, I feel like there's a lot of stuff that we could talk about 2009, not just teams related, but discussion points and crazy stuff that was happening.
But
would that be a good idea?
That would be a perfect idea. But before we get to that, I just want to add one small bit of Toro Rosso lore, so to speak, because the only interesting thing they did in 2009 was a publicity stunt they planned for the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, which was the hiring of World Rally champion Sebastian Loeb.
See, sometimes we do actually come back to our, we'll get back to that later moments. Sometimes our links do actually have an end.
Yeah, it was obviously a cheap publicity stunt. The FIA did tell them to sort off, which is bad because we did not get a low reject profile out of it, which makes that officially the worst thing the FIA have ever done at Abu Dhabi.
Okay. Yeah, alright. I won't take that bait.
I would have been disappointed had you. Actually, I wouldn't. But yeah, 2009 had, of course, a lot of beautiful stories. First thing, though, before we go to the really interesting one, we talked about curse, but we also did not really talk much about the other two big technical changes of that year.
Mm-hmm.
The return to slick tires after over 10 years of grooved ones. And I realized we didn't talk about it because at least I don't really have an opinion on it. Do you?
Nope.
Excellent.
Next.
And
What's
of
the
course
other interesting discussion point?
And of course the new aero routes, which we partly touched on. The very unorthodox design philosophy, so to speak, of very wide front wings and very small rear wings. I mostly remember the other jokes that were made about it at the time, like how ugly they look, how out of place it is, and how weird they are. And while that was true, and it actually remained true for the existence of the lifespan of that aerodynamic rule set, even the 2016 ones still look a bit off if you look at them today. The results are beyond reproach in terms of their ability to enhance the racing. There are many fans, both current and former, who still feel the 2009 to 2016 period was one of the finest periods in terms of quality of racing. So yeah, it was.
Sure.
That doesn't sound like you agree much, do you?
I would have to think if I disagree with it. I won't disagree with it now because I simply don't have the ammunition with me on the other side. So I'll let that pass.
We can get to it in a future podcast. And one more thing, the whole double diffuser thing. There's one particularly interesting fact about this story. And it involves the team we must not name. Because in an interview down the road, or actually very early into the season, if I recall correctly, Ross Brawn said that he more or less warned the FIA, hey, there's this loophole in the rule that certain teams could take advantage of.
Yes.
Do you want to fix
I
that?
know this one.
And the FIA said, nah, it's good. And so the man who warned them of the loophole took advantage of that loophole and got 2 championships out of it, so...
I do love that story because it's like he basically asked the governing body for permission to exploit the new rules, and they're like, sure. Yeah, I mean, I guess they had in their mind that they were just happy for Brawn to be on the grid, and they were probably just happy to do anything they could to help, as Mercedes were, for example, and they were probably also banking on the idea that the manufacturers would get KERS right, and blitz the field, for example, and it just didn't happen.
Yeah, and of course they probably also expected the very well-paid aerodynamicists of those teams to also recognize that possibility, which they didn't, or they just underestimated it, like, okay, yeah, that's a loophole, but it's not like it's going to give an underfunded team 2 world championships. Now will it?
Yeah, famous last words.
It's sort of like in those very cheap historical educational films you have. Oh, it's the that Da Vinci guy will never amount to anything. So who cares what he draws? But yeah, it is what it is, and it worked out for some. It didn't work out for others. But it's just a hilarious story of how you should listen to people who warn you. Speaking of people who warn you, actually that has nothing to do with it. We should have been warned off them in the early 80s, but Bernie Ecclestone had a very beautiful idea. which he first actually executed in cooperation with the FIA, and then wanted, after that was soundly rejected by the teams, to then have a variation of. And that rule change was that the Formula One World Champion should be decided by the amount of total wins in a season.
Yes, the medal system. This would basically mean that a first place would trump any other result. So effectively, points would be counted second after these medals. So the more first places you have, the more you would win. If two people have the same number of first places, they would just do second places, and so on and so forth. And then after third place, they would then count the points. So basically, points being there to count the prizes for the teams, the medals being there to count the winners of the championship.
And boy, was it a terrible idea.
It was also an idea that was thrust upon the teams literally like a week before the season began as well. It wasn't even like it was a preordained thing. It was just something which Bernie Ecclestone mouthed off to the media, presumably as some kind of power play for some kind of 4D chess that he was playing at some point in the early 2009.
The thing is, it was actually decided as a rule. It was just the teams had the power, well, back then and both now, to reject such very short notice rule changes, and they obviously said, "What's wrong with you?" And well, we ended up not getting that rule, which again is good because it would have killed pretty much racing itself. And I don't mean that in the usual neophobic way motorsports fans tend to talk about things like this, like, "Oh no, this change will ruin racing forever," trademark. But in the actual, no one is racing anymore sense, because up to a certain point it would have eliminated most any reason to really try after this podium position. If you weren't contending for those, then you're not giving it anywhere near your 100%.
Yeah, I think they reckoned, they did do, I think, 10 years after 2009, I think they did a quick search as to what the seasons would have looked like in that medal system, for example, and most of them would have been decided like a race or two earlier than they would have been that they were in real life. And so, for example, 2009, it would have been resolved in after Singapore. Button would have won, which was another 3 races.
And given as Formula One has already mightily struggled to get championships to actually go down to the wire, that is not good.
Yeah, I think certain seasons like Max Verstappen's last year might have been something of a walkover, even more so than the real thing was. But it would also, if you think about it, really incentivize like early winning and then just kind of sitting on your arse for the rest of the season. Because if you have winning late, is only really good if you want to win the season at the last moment. But like, it just means that anyone who gets an early season drive, so to speak, who really gets a couple of wins, like Button did in 2009, kind of just can sit on their laurels, as Button did, and win the season with many races to spare, as Button did. But it was one of the more famous of Bernie Ecclestone's crazy late stage ideas. I'm not sure when he came up with the sprinkler idea, but I think it was around about the same time as well.
I think that was 2010, but don't nail my feet to the floor on that one.
There was even a Guardian. Sorry, there was even a Guardian advert. I remember at the time, the Guardian newspaper had some kind of advert for and they were talking about different sports and different like news you can read about, and it's like the new rule in Formula One, the spin zone, and Formula One driver would jump out of their car during the pit stop and get spun around 50 times, and then thrown back in the car, and then had to keep driving. Along with many other arbitrary, stupid rules that F1 was looking at implementing at the time.
But speaking of teams versus the FIA, the storyline of 2009 were the new teams, but actually that was not the one that we were going to talk about.
Yeah, you preempted the previous one with people who warn you, but I assumed you were going to this segue when you talked about people who warn you.
Yeah, we are now getting to what the Formula One rejects former site owners used to call Formula Elaborate Bluff, the Grand Prix World Championship. In During the negotiations for the new Concord agreement at the time, teams were not happy with what the FIA and particular Ecclestone were doing and proposing. In particular, the FIA under Max Mosley had very radical ideas for the future of the sport. Namely, they wanted to introduce a budget cap, and a rather strict one at that. And in the first couple of seasons of the transition from the current spend all you want formula to the new budget cap era, there would be a split rule set, so to speak. The teams that would obey the budget cap, which would have been most likely Williams and most of the new teams that were being added at the time, would have been permitted various technical advantages, such as the very speculative idea of a four-wheel drive Formula One car. I am not a technical expert, so if you do know or if you can make a reasonable case for whether a four-wheel F1 car is an advantage or not, please do so in the comment. I would be genuinely interested to hear from you. Or even better, join our Discord and let us know so we can turn that into an entire article. We are always looking for new writers, so doors more than open. Anyway, obviously the teams were not aboard with that budget cap in general, and in particular not with the extreme version Mosley was proposing. And thus they did what teams who are unhappy tend to do and threaten to go away. Except this time they wouldn't leave Formula One, or just leave Formula One, but they would establish a rival series. Having apparently not learned the lesson from the only now, at the time, very recently ending American open wheel war, which ended up pushing both series well behind NASCAR, but you know what they say about those who don't learn from history?
Doomed to repeat it, and I suppose we are very thankful that they did not repeat it. Briatore especially was one of the main voices behind this breakaway series, which would allow these companies to spend a huge amount of money as they wanted. If I'm not mistaken, it was something like 50 million euros was the proposed budget cap, which is, when you compare to something like, I just looked it up while Lennart was talking, if you're considering something like the 300 million euro budgets that McLaren and Ferrari were operating from, you're looking at an 83% drop in budget for the next season, which I'm not an accountant and I'm not a logistics director, but I feel like 10% knocking off might be possible. 20% would be a stretch, but doing an 83% drop in the space of a year, I might have some struggles maintaining your brand new motorhome, which, for example, McLaren was showing off to the world in the middle of the recession about how many floors that their padding facilities had. It was a bizarre time where basically the FIA were desperately trying to pull back, especially in the form of Mosley, who had a bit more of a spine at least than John Todt did, desperately trying to pull back the basically trying to restrain the teams. Because in the middle of a recession, the last thing they needed was more teams going under from uncontrolled spending, and, so to speak, what should we call them? Skittish, skittish manufacturers pulling out otherwise. It was a dark time to be a Formula One director, so to speak.
Well, one of the things I find most interesting about this whole GPVC thing is just how much history has vindicated the FIA, and mostly in particular on that one. There is not a single point that speaks towards the position of the team at the time in hindsight. First off, most of the GPVC teams were out of the sport either at the end of 2009 or at the end of 2010. BMW were gone, Renault were gone, Toyota were gone. That is like around half of them. Oh, did I say Renault were gone?
Yep.
Good. They were super gone, so to speak. No. We ended up with a budget cap, and it proved to be a sensible choice. We ended up with technology designed to make Formula One more road relevant in terms of the hybrid engines, which I presume was the intention behind the ideas of a four-wheeled Formula One drive. Again, not technical expert nor a particular expert on the car market. I don't know whether four-wheel drive cars were a big thing at the time. Again, if you know, feel free to let us know. And so, yeah. It is one of the very tragedies of Max Mosley's life and work that a lot of what he was doing in the mid to late 2000s proved being proven completely and 100% correct in hindsight. Of course, he still had his blunders. The whole defending tobacco advertising thing, obviously, given as it is very proven to be a very good choice in terms of public health. But he was doing that for the sake of motorsport. That money still in a way hasn't been recovered. Like, it certainly isn't that like it was particularly in the late 80s, early 90s, where Marlboro was funding like half of the Formula One grid. But yeah, obviously outside of those blunders, it is just amazing just how much the FIA and how much Mosley were proven right in terms of what happened in the future. But at the time, he was about as popular as Athlete's Foot. And so he found himself politically outmaneuvered and booted out of the FIA, partly because of the opposition by the manufacturers and partly because of an unfortunate scandal involving, let's just call them entertainers.
Prostitutes? No, okay. Entertainers. We'll go with that. I'll bleep mine side up.
Yes. You can leave it in. I just wanted to be diplomatic about it. Unusually for me, but gotta give it a shot sometimes.
Yeah, we're I guess we're now looking through Max Mosley's era of rose-tinted glasses because he had basic common sense and he tried to use his powers to install some kind of basic common sense for the spiraling costs of Formula One, and we all know these things don't last forever, and F1 won't last forever no matter how much money is thrown into it and taken out of it. All things must pass, and Mosley was doing his best to see if he could sustain the series for a bit longer, and I suppose, as you say, in hindsight he was. But the Grand Prix World Championship, which was the very roundabout way that we got into this bit, was basically an attempt by the teams to basically break away and form their own series, which never materialized. They had a calendar, some kind of basic thing. They had the basic kind of leverage that they could show to the press. Hey, look, we're serious about this. But mostly it was just leverage to get their way.
So the calendar would have been really fascinating to see actually put in execution, because if I am a FIA president and I want to kneecap a Formula One competition series, what is the absolute first thing I do? I take every road course they visit and scrap their FIA licenses. Like, no one races there. You hear me? No one. And the question is how many tracks would have gone along with that, and what they would have filled those that wouldn't have gone along with it up. Were more street trail circuits or just shorter calendars, period? Would have been very interesting to find that out, at least, even though the rest would have been not good.
Yeah, but yeah, it's one of the most interesting things that happened in 2009, and it didn't even happen. Maybe I could move us forward. One other thing which didn't happen as well, which was sort of reached its peak in 2009, was also at the end of Silverstone. 2009 was also a year where Silverstone finally got the makeover and the money and injection from the British government that it had been desperately requiring for many, many years, which it eventually got. But it brought to an end a very long saga of Silverstone dropping off the calendar, the greatest race in Formula One history, the first F1 race, etc., etc. It was also a lot of politics going on where I think Damon Hill, if I'm not mistaken, was the man who actually rose to the scene as the saviour, who headed up the British Racing Drivers Club and renovated Silverstone properly in 2010, 2011 to the current layout with modern facilities and things. But it's funny when you look back through the news in 2009 and half the articles are about Silverstone, no more Silverstone, how on earth will we cope? And I wonder if that kind of thing would happen today. Let's just say that if we were in the same situation today where Silverstone was badly in need of renovation, would Liberty Media step up to replace it? I wonder, but that's just speculation, so to speak.
So that brings horrible memories back. Now, not because of Silverstone or because of British media or anything, but there was actually a plan to replace Silverstone as a British Grand Prix. And that plan was Donington. And there was a plan for a rebuild of Donington to make it Formula One suitable. Because I think the old Grand Prix layout wasn't certainly not getting a Grade 1 license. And that redesign was horrible. Just absolutely atrocious. To give a bit more context, it was a change that would have seen a lot of what is, well, could technically be called the infield be used to make a very squiggly extension to get the track up to length and up to speed. And as someone who loves Donington as a track, this would have been very appalling, very awful, because I already dislike the Grand Prix loop extension because it breaks the otherwise very beautiful flow of a lap at Donington. But that would have completely destroyed the national circuit, made it completely unusable, and it would have just killed what I personally consider to be the most fun, the most entertaining track to drive in simulations, and probably in real life if I were a real racing driver. And just that's why the story of Silverstone dropping off the calendar that was going around in the late 2000s, because even the 2008 coverage was already advertised as the last race at Silverstone. And that is why that is always a small pseudo-traumatic memory for me, because I am just grateful that while I openly admit I'm not the biggest fan of Silverstone, even before the redesign, it is a track that has undeniably proven it provides very entertaining racing. And I am just glad that we have it and not that abomination of a Donington redesign.
Yeah, I think we can both be agreed on that at the very least. I guess, not to be too political, but I guess the Silverstone is somewhat like the NHS in that we're constantly being told that it's in need of saving, and then it gets saved once every 3 or 4 years, very dramatically, and it's always great when it gets saved, but it always seems to need saving a few years later. I'm thinking that we could go towards our rejects of the year. I have about 27 more things I want to talk about, but I feel like if we move our direction towards the rejects of the year, I think we can basically get through just about all of them as we go through.
Well, there's one small point I want to jump off using Silverstone that I think we kind of cannot let completely go unaddressed. Because 2009 was also the debut of a very controversial track that has in some ways shaped Formula One history and in itself the development of where the series is going in terms of tracks. Because 2009 was the very first Abu Dhabi Grand Prix.
Woohoo!
Yay! I actually like the track, so.
The Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. I actually have that, funnily enough, as one of my 27 dishonorable mentions of the 2009 season was the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, which we had 1 hour on Friday, 1 hour on Saturday, 1 hour on Sunday of the BBC coverage showing us about how amazing the roller coaster was at Ferrari World, how amazing the hotel is here. Have you seen the champagne that they serve, says David Coulthard. Look at me, I'm in a hot tub, says Eddie Jordan. Fantastic, isn't it? Like, ew.
I don't want to see Eddie Jordan in a hot tub. Like, I got a mental image now, it's so nasty.
So, Abu Dhabi Grand Prix was hyped to the hills. The 17th and final race of the season. It's going to be the biggest thing known to man. And the season was already wrapped up in Interlagos, thank goodness. We went to Abu Dhabi as a dead rubber race, in which it was a dead rubber race, as it was, often is, and almost always is. The Abu Dhabi Grand Prix began in 2009. It set a precedent for many, many things. And for that reason, for that very short, so to speak, unembellished point, I shall name it one of the 27 dishonorable mentions for my Reject of the Year podium in 2009.
I cannot disagree with you. The race itself was very disappointing. It was a Red Bull 1-2, if I recall correctly, after McLaren bit the dust, metaphorically speaking.
And Braun 3-4 as well.
Yeah, but the thing is, again, I like the track. I even liked it before the 2021 redesign, so I'm kind of weird like that. But yeah, it's had a lot of unfortunate precedents, and it, as it often does, didn't get the title decider it pays so much money for, which I think eventually will come back to haunt Formula 1, but that's neither here nor there. It didn't even have a great farewell ceremony for a former champion of the past, like, say, the 2022 race or the 2017 race. No, wait, the 2016 race, which actually had a world title fight, so nobody cared about Button then.
Yeah. No, he had his farewell race in Monaco the following year.
The 2021 race, that was... No, wait, the 20... There was another farewell race when the championship was decided, but... Felipe Massa in 2017, that was it.
Felipe Massa never won a world championship. However much I like to think he did, he sadly didn't win it.
No, and his farewell in 2017 was also wet fart after he had already had his retirement ceremony the year before, so...
I was about to say, it was at least better than his 2016 farewell.
That was... poor Abu Dhabi, really.
I mean, the most interesting thing about the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, aside from being, I'm not joking, the very first time Lewis Hamilton ever retired from a race from a technical failure, the fact that Toyota left the sport, announced it was leaving Formula 1 about 2 days later, after announcing to the world that it was not leaving Formula 1. And then a week after that, Jenson Button landing a McLaren drive for 2010, which must be among the infinite improbability drive of the year moments of all infinite improbability drive of the year moments. If you made your predictions at the beginning of the year and thought, where will Button be in 2010 if he will even be in a job? And you'd be, oh yeah, he'll be next to Lewis Hamilton.
Yeah, no.
It's quite a turnaround in fortune. It's quite a turnaround in fortune, to say the very least. And hats off to him. Considering the state Formula 1 was in the end of 2008, and considering where he ended up himself, he basically extended his career by 7 seasons after Braun, when people thought he was out of Formula 1 for good. So
yeah, both drivers of the team we shall not mention have gotten a couple of years more.
No.
Way too late for that.
My apologies.
No.
I guess it was technically after the season, so it's...
Yes, perfect, flawless. I counted. I'll allow it. Now, onto the Reject of the Year podium. And because we had the situation last podcast, where our podiums ended up a bit similar in many regards, we have decided to add a small rule to our retrospective podiums. We cannot feature the same person, team, entity, whatever, at the same, so this time we are going to be a lot more interesting, and thus we actually know most of what our podiums are, but you don't, so you can still pretend to be excited.
Yeah. My goodness, I am looking forward to what you pick, Leonard. So the idea is that Lennart picked 3, I picked 3, he had priority this time, so his one stayed, and I picked a couple more, because there are a lot of possibilities for a Reject of the Year in 2009. But before we get onto it, I want to say a few more dishonorable mentions. Namely, we were talking about who would have predicted that Jenson Button would be McLaren in 2010. My first dishonorable mention after the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix will be the Autosport team, editorial team, for in their consensus predicting that Ferrari and Kimi Raikkonen would walk the 2009 Formula 1 season. Which, let's just say, didn't happen. My second dishonorable mention goes to a certain Finn named Kimi Raikkonen, who had a proper dud season for much of the season. And he only stepped up when it was really possible for him to actually really win. It comes back to our conversation that we always bring up about Raikkonen. Is he motivated? Is he not motivated? Is he phoning it in every other race, or is he actually, this is as good as he is? Yada, yada, yada. 2009 was the season where he got paid not to race for Ferrari. They would prefer to pay for Alonso to race and just have Kimi sit at home. He didn't get hired by anyone else, despite potential interest from McLaren, who actually paid for Button over him. He spent the season attracting controversy. This was the famous season when there was that out of context viral video where it looks like he'd whacked a child, but it was actually out of context. But this kind of bad press around him. Then there was the ice cream incident during the Malaysian Grand Prix. Red flag
forever.
Yeah, when he was seen in the Ferrari garage. Bear in mind, while Felipe Massa was in his car talking to his engineer Rob Smedley, famously talking about Felipe baby, stay cool and all that.
He needed the right visors. Why didn't they give him the right visors? I love that theory. I love that.
We miss you, Rob Smedley. We miss you. It's the F1 is sadder about Rob Smedley.
What is he doing now, anyways?
He's sitting on a yacht. Hopefully he's earned his keep.
I'm curious. I gotta find that out now.
Well, I'm just finding out. I'll just basically say that Raikkonen attracted a lot of bad press. He was the highest paid driver on the grid, and he was hanging around eating ice cream when he should have been preparing for races. He was attracting bad press in the paddock. He was doing rallying and crashing, which, although I'm sure he wasn't in any real danger, it just amplified the bad press coming towards him when he should have been, driving faster, which would have been good. So for that reason, I'm going to dishonorably mention Kimi Raikkonen, although I might be being harsh, because he did have a great second half of the season in the fact that he won a race and was on the podium enough times. But I think most people would probably say that had Massa been there, Raikkonen would have been number 2 still at the team.
For the record, Rob Smedley is working as a director of data systems for the Formula One group, so good on him. Right. And he
did it right for himself. And
he founded a low-cost electric kart series called Total Karting.
Total Karting, nice.
So he's made a life for himself, which is good.
Yeah, it's a nice shout out to Total Karting.
You're welcome, Rob, for the free advertising.
Other dishonorable mentions: the Japanese Grand Prix and Brazilian Grand Prix qualifyings, which each had 3 red flags. Can you imagine red flags in a qualifying session, Leonard?
Oh God,
they don't do that anymore.
The horror.
But Toro Rosso spent both of those sessions basically driving into the wall and/or the grass all the whole time. But please go ahead. What were you going to say?
No, I just wanted to point out that back then that was actually very new. So we were just kind of in the situation where, okay, this red flag is taking long. Okay, they will continue eventually. Whereas nowadays we pretty much know, okay, we got a red flag, they're going to wait until the track dries up so I can go play video games for an hour or whatever I want to do. So
order some food and scratch your arse, basically. Yeah. You know they'll be back for the last couple of laps. There's not the sense of unknowing as there used to be.
Yeah, but that was just a funny notion to that red flag thing. But yeah, those are very good nominations so far.
Toro Rosso, another dishonorable mention. They came last in the championship. I mentioned before that they got lots of double retirements. They didn't get any podiums, pole positions, or fastest laps. The only team not to do so. Unmotivated driver and a bunch of rookies who weren't ready, probably. Except Buemi was ready, but just not good enough to get anything. Toyota, we've also mentioned they had the second fastest car at the beginning of the year, got a couple of podiums. I didn't mention actually that Timo Glock qualified last at Monaco. I just want to say that with no follow-up, no comment. Dishonorable mention to Adrian Sutil. He threw away a couple of points opportunities which he had, specifically again at Singapore, which we seem to mention a lot. Italy, he fluffed up his qualifying lap when he could have got pole, which is something that Giancarlo Fisichella did not do. It's something about Adrian Sutil's career that he, as you would say, Larry, he just wasn't it. And he had a couple of near moments where he could have got a podium, such as at Monza. He could have got some points for Force India, but aside from that one Monza 4th place, which could have been better, he didn't get any points for the rest of the season. And for that, he deserves some criticism, I would say.
Yeah, I wouldn't go so far as to make him a dishonorable mention for Reject of the Year, but I can't disagree with your points, and as you so rightfully quoted me, he wasn't it. So, a terminal case of not being it, in fact. So, yeah. All
right.
All that's left to do is get to the magic podium after all.
Two more dishonorable mentions, and then we'll get there.
God, I am jealous.
Heikki Kovalainen crashed. By China he had mastered. By China he had managed to do 0 laps of racing in Formula 1 in 2009. He had a lot of first lap crashes. He was nowhere close to Hamilton in a year where Hamilton was basically half asleep for the first half of the season, didn't give a crap. And Kovalainen did not step up. He got beaten even more in the second half and was rightfully out of a McLaren drive at the end of the year. And my final dishonorable mention, someone who we've mentioned one word in passing this entire time, Luca Badoer, who remains one of the few, if not the only driver to ever qualify a Ferrari last on the grid on merit. And he did it twice.
I can't disagree with you, but it makes me feel sad, so...
It makes me feel sad to say so, and that's probably why Lennart and I haven't mentioned his name in a 2009 review until now. But we love you, Luca, and we still remember... We still remember the European Grand Prix of 1999. Our hearts are all with you.
Yeah, on that bit of tragedy, let's get to the Reject of the Year podium. Would you mind if I start?
Please do.
Because I mentioned the word tragedy before, and the manufacturer and the team I applied it to very much embody that tragedy, and that is BMW Sauber. As we talked about earlier, it is just tragic that they abandoned their 2008 development for that car. It's tragic that they couldn't continue the positive momentum from the years before that would have in theory, or should have in theory, led to them being one of the elite teams of Formula 1 that would have had them set up perfectly for the 2010s, but instead they had a bad car, they withdrew from the sport, ended up in DTM a couple of years later, instead of ruling Formula 1 with an iron fist, which possibly they could have if everything had gone right. It's just a waste of money of two very good drivers, and as I said, tragedy.
Yeah, I don't want to blame BMW for Robert Kubica's checking out, but also it's like they made one of the best drivers on the grid of that era basically just check out.
And given that he would return with full fire in 2010, I am more inclined to blame BMW.
Yeah, no, more than deserved for a podium. I would say that. My third place, I accidentally said already. I was so excited about my dishonorable mentions that I accidentally named one of my top three, and that was Luca Badoer, who I'm being as generous as I can to by only putting him third. But yes, he had 10 years of being a Ferrari test driver. He came back to Formula 1 in the 1 year which began the ban on in-season testing. So it was the one car he basically had never driven in. And it was the one chance he had, or two chances, because it was two races. And he blew it. And he added two races to his very depressing record of the most races either started or entered without a point to his name. And he remains perhaps the ultimate reject, and he even drove for Ferrari. So all's well that ends well.
Well, that was a very cheerful third place for both of us. So, on to second, because I don't actually have much more to say about Luca Badoer, because, yeah, it's just that. And the second place goes to a company that wasn't even on the grid in 2009. And that is Honda. Now, is it harsh to judge a company for not foreseeing the future? In itself, no. But, as I mentioned before, Ross Brawn more or less asked the FIA, yeah, is this okay? Is this loophole we found? Can we cheat the system, so to speak? They must have known that. And in a year where all other manufacturer teams more or less made a fool out of themselves, in a year where every other manufacturer was finding themselves slapped in the face by Brawn and by Red Bull, that very year you pull out after spending millions and millions and millions on two Earth Dreams cars, which were both horrible, when you otherwise have a very good history of, while withdrawing on top, at least actually being on top when you do that. Here, you abandon the 1 year that would have been your breakthrough, that you were in a way working for once it was clear, yeah, we're not going to fix this in 2008. And you leave Ross Brawn to have all the glory for himself, and nobody thinks about Honda when they think about the 2009 World title. Even though most of that car was paid for by Honda. Let's not forget that. Brawn itself was borderline bankrupt for pretty much the entire year. And that car was completely Honda built and Honda paid for, but nobody talks about Honda except as the backstory. And that is just a complete corporate failure, top to bottom.
They say there's no such publicity. There's no such thing as bad publicity, but Honda managed to get no publicity, which is even worse. It's funny how so many of our talking points of 2009 happened in 2008. But the pullout of like, I've heard stories about how Ross Brawn, when he was making decisions, or if he was doing even basic strategic planning for the Honda team when he was in charge, he had to go to Tokyo to like present his strategy to the board, even though he didn't really have anything to say. He just had to be there to sort of be the face of it. And it's like, it was a very, very corporatized, very, very, very slow way of doing things. And not to generalize, but it may even have been the same in Toyota, for example. At Honda specifically, like, Brawn had so much paperwork and so much red tape to get through when he wanted to make any kind of creative or innovative decisions. And it's funny just how well he did the moment that red tape disappeared. He suddenly the whole thing turned around literally overnight, basically. It couldn't have happened to a nicer guy and a nicer team, and there couldn't have been a nicer story for Formula One in the middle of a recession when half the teams were leaving. It was such a nice turnaround. And also, as you say, like, you mentioned it and I didn't think about it, but the whiplash of how bad Honda were, even worse than Toyota, for example, like how bad Honda were the previous 2 years. If they had gone from being basically last to world champions, it would have been such a good news story for them as well. But it was a no news story. It was, no one cares if it was Honda. So I 100% agree with that. You actually stole that off of my Reject of the Year podium.
Ruthless aggression on the Teammate Collision podcast. We don't have that name for nothing. So I just want to add a funny thought that crossed my mind with the whole Ross Brawn had to go to Tokyo to present his things point. How fortunate it would have been had work from home been a thing at that time already. It would have made the decision process so much more efficient, but alas, no global pandemic to inspire that one yet. Anyway, on to your second place.
Only cheery thoughts on the Teammate Collision podcast. My second place is racing. 2009 must be one of the dullest seasons of the last 30 years, probably since the early 90s, for actual on-track racing. name me a famous overtake or a famous incident not involving a Japanese driver in 2009.
Raikkonen overtaking Fisichella would be my first guess.
Okay.
Okay, now
Sure.
I'm seriously
Okay.
thinking about what overtakes happened.
I'll give you that one. My point being that 2009 was not a very exciting year for racing. It followed 2008, which was a decent year for on-track racing. 2007 was a bit more dull when it came to the front, but you had a season whereby 9 teams got a podium, a pole position, or a fastest lap, and there were qualifying sessions which were way more exciting than the races, because you had the top to the bottom basically separated by something like a second or a second and a half from beginning to end in the whole grid stretch. It was incredibly close grids over 1 lap pace. You had different teams being better or worse on different weekends. You had Force Indias getting poles. You had Fernando Alonso getting a podium in that Renault. You had even BMW Sauber getting the occasional great result, and there was almost no interesting racing to speak of. I can think of the Brazilian Grand Prix had a lot of great moments, usually involving cars catching fire or spinning off or getting bumped into by Japanese drivers.
Or having punctures.
Or having punctures.
Not bringing up any trauma or anything.
No. It's not in my mind. And
That was so clear.
2009, in retrospect, it's a very boring season to rewatch, because outside of all these stories, which you may have noticed that most of them happened off track or the previous year, the actual on track product in 2009 was very dull, and for that I give it my second place on my Rejects of the Year podium, because it is so striking to rewatch that season as to how boring it is to rewatch, and I've rewatched the whole thing.
The thing is, I want just to stress that me bringing up Raikkonen and Fisichella is not meant to be an argument against what you said, because even the most boring seasons in racing history have some amazing, breathtaking paths that you can find and put in a highlight montage, even a couple of them. Like, for example, take the not so exciting 2007 on the track. We have the infamous Sato on Alonso pass, just to name one. So,
Of course.
that is not really an argument against the season being boring. Oh, look at how it's this great one move, because every season, in every racing series, in every form of car on the planet has one great move each year at least. So, this was never meant to be a disagreement with you, that I answered your rhetorical question. So, yeah, I fully get that. Sometimes seasons are just not very fun to rewatch, especially if you don't pay attention to the off-track narrative in which 2009 shined. So, yeah.
I think, just for context, just so I can clarify this, I think I might be wrong. I probably am, at least somewhat wrong. I think 2007 had something like 1 or 2 overtakes for the lead over the entire season, which were not on literally on the first corner, so to speak. And one of those was Massa letting Raikkonen past to win the championship. So it's when it came to...
So that was actually an on-track pass. They did that through pit stop.
Was it? Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, so this is why I'm getting it confused and perhaps mixed up. But yes, my point about 2007 specifically was that I think there was basically 1 on-track pass for the lead, and I think that was when Marcus Winkelhock got overtaken, which I'm not sure that really counts as a...
Yes, and after racing, we race to first place on the Reject of the Year podium, which for me is Kazuki Nakajima. As
Our Japanese hero, yes.
As I said when we discussed Williams earlier in the podcast, Nakajima had a very good 2008 by what was expected of him. He was a very reliable driver, not as fast as Nico Rosberg, but nobody in their right mind expected him to be. But he collected points sensibly, safely, didn't make a fool of himself, had a couple of nice races, and then came 2009 and everything just went up into smoke. And there are probably many reasons for it, some of which we will never know, because drivers and teams tend to be professional about these things and not lay out exactly why driver XY failed, and if it isn't something extremely obvious, like say Mick Schumacher's failure at Haas or Nikita Mazepin's failure at Haas or the failure that is Haas.
Setting a pattern here, yeah.
Yeah, back to the point. It is just something that we will never fully understand, but we don't need to understand it. To understand that it was very bad. It got him out of the sport when the Stefan project fell apart, and rightfully so. And when you score no points and your teammate scores enough points to put your team well ahead in the championship of better funded teams like Renault, and I don't know, were Toro Rosso at the time better funded than Williams? Doesn't matter. The point still stands. Nakajima was not good, and thus he was the reject of the year because he was the worst in a season that had a lot of bad and horrible teams and drivers.
I would say Nakajima, I agree with everything you said. Nakajima has the misfortune of being involved in perhaps one of the most symbolic incidents in Formula 1 history, and that was when Kamui Kobayashi made his debut. And I want to say a dishonorable mention that we've spent 2 hours talking about 2009 and not once mentioned Kamui Kobayashi's name even until now.
Damn, my Takuma Sato propaganda strategy almost worked.
The late, great, insurmountable, domineering Kamui Kobayashi made his debut at the Brazilian Grand Prix that year. And he overtook Kazuki Nakajima during the race, and didn't just overtake him, but basically shoved him out of the way, basically spooking Nakajima into spinning onto the grass and out of the race into the wall in quite a dramatic fashion. And it definitely turned a lot of heads, raised their eyebrows at him, because he was in his first race and he was behaving quite aggressively to Nakajima. But it was within the rules, and like he hadn't shoved him into the wall or anything like that. But it was just like, wow, here's this young hotshot Japanese driver who's just in his first race, and he's scored. He didn't score points, I don't think, but he did in his second race. He was very close to scoring points. He even diced it with Jenson Button, basically driver of the race in his first race. And then you consider Kazuki Nakajima, who was at the end of his second season, who got spooked by some guy at Toyota who basically just turned up because I think Timo Glock damaged his leg, I think it was. But yeah, the substitute made you look bad. And if we talk about Toyota drivers and how the Japanese drivers are often selected by their corporate teams, you wonder that if Toyota had continued, for example, in some capacity, that Kamui wouldn't have just stepped into Nakajima's place. Very long-winded way of saying that Nakajima was very bad. And the moment Kobayashi came along, suddenly everyone went, "Hey, look, a good Japanese driver," and Nakajima's career was dead.
The whole "I don't want to play with you anymore" meme springs to mind for those more versed in internet culture. Yeah, it is what it is, and that's the entire tragedy, really, of the Nakajima story. That he was good, but then he stopped being good, and someone new and also good came along, and thus the old, formerly good one was history.
Indeed. And speaking of not being very good, my reject of the year is the same one that Jamie Enoch picked, which is Nelson Piquet Jr. I put him as my reject of the year because surely, in my opinion, no one else could deserve it more. He scored... Let's stick with the on-track stuff for now. He scored no points. He had one of the worst qualifying records compared to his teammate or in general of any driver of the era, or maybe any era. He was a terrible qualifier. He was mediocre at best during the races. Famously in China, if I remember correctly, he was driving around and bashing himself into all the polystyrene boards.
Yeah, that was in China.
He wasn't very good in the dry. He wasn't very good in the wet. He was like a fellow Brazilian. He complained a lot. He basically decided that everyone else and everything else was at fault except for himself. He had a terrible attitude problem.
And unlike the other Brazilian, he wasn't right about it.
You got me with that one. And the other thing is that Crashgate. He was the one who brought the evidence. He was the one who blew the whistle against his former employer, Flavio Briatore and Pat Simmons, which pulled ING out of Renault, basically pulled Renault out of the sport in all but name in 2010, and he did it because he got fired. The thing which makes Piquet Jr. such a reject of the year for me is the fact that the one positive thing he did, which was be honest, was only done because he had full immunity and because he did it to spite people. There was no positivity from him. There was no goodness in him in what he did. He only stepped forward for a crime that he was entirely complicit in because he wanted to bring other people down, and just a selfish, not very good driver who maybe now in retrospect we maybe downplay it, but he cheated, and as far as I'm aware it's still the only real on-track cheating of this kind which made someone else win a race of this proportion ever in Formula 1 history. And it could have had huge lasting implications to bring down Formula 1 itself if you had this kind of distrust and this kind of you're in the middle of a recession as well. God. Yeah. The end. Nelson Piquet Jr. is my reject of the year.
Yeah. The thing is, this is something I need to clarify first. At the very least, speaking for myself here. Generally, it should be pointed out that whistleblowers are something very positive and very important.
Yes.
The thing is, and up to a certain point, that is, for example, why he didn't feature on my Reject of the Year podium, partly because, compared to Nakajima, he had a much stronger teammates. Sorry to all Rosberg fans, but he is no Fernando Alonso, and he never will, and he never will be, and he never was. But secondly, I understand why the pettiness of his actions is something many people would find very appalling, and they are not motivations I endorse, admire, or anything. It's just that because I am generally more pro whistleblower, I don't hold him as much against Piquet as you do, but this is not meant to suggest that what he did was right, because in the end he himself got involved in it. He did, as you pointed out, only come out with it when he was sacked, and rightfully sacked, as much as I earlier in the podcast called the decision stupid in the terms of how do I put this, on what you do to yourself by it, but it's not stupid in the sense of replacing a driver of poor quality, because that was what Piquet was. So I am certainly not going to disagree with your choice as his position as Reject of the Year. It's just that small part I wanted to clarify. So otherwise their points are perfectly valid, especially the sportive ones, and again the whole questionable attitude, where the apple doesn't fall far from the tree now, does it? And
it's a very woe is me kind of attitude.
Yeah.
Oh, how badly was I done by? It's like, well, actually, you were the one who did it. At the end of the day.
Simple as, and the consequences could have been terrifying, and that's why Flavio Briatore got banned for life, which was the right decision, even if they eventually reversed it to no effect, because he still hasn't been seen in the Formula 1 paddock as a relevant player. So just as worthy a Reject of the Year as my choice, which obviously was why Formula1Reject.com also made him the Reject of the Year. So you are not going to get any disagreement out of me.
We are approaching the end of the podcast. I would just like to maybe say a few things that I really like from 2009. I was, so to speak, disparaging the racing of 2009, but I want to say that, for example, Kamui Kobayashi, who we spoke about, was a real breath of fresh air when it came into to the season late on. One of the most epic opening laps I know of in Formula One history is this Turkish Grand Prix from that year, when back in the days when they had pit strategy, Vettel had qualified on pole ahead of Jenson Button. Yes, I'm calling them by their names even. And Vettel had less fuel than Button did, and so it was his strategy to get ahead and to blast away, to see if he could basically undercut Button with less fuel. And what happened was an incredibly dicey first corner and first lap until they came out of the Istanbul, so I don't know what you call that. It was like the triple corner hairpin, like the gigantic hairpin out into the main straight. And then Vettel had a tiny wobble and just slipped off the track and came back on, and it was just too slow to stop Button from getting past, and Button overtook him, and from that moment on dominated the race because Button had more fuel and had the track position. But I remember watching that live, and that was, as a young person, that was one of the most exciting things I'd see at that point, where it was these two guys fighting for the championship basically against each other. And that was probably Button's finest win of 2009, because it was the one, probably only one, where he was really being challenged outside of just his teammate. Vettel had a very solid chance at winning that race, and Button actually beat him on merit, and it was a really, really epic first lap. So that's one thing I want to talk about, just mentioned as a really good point from that season. We haven't really talked about the Liegate, where Hamilton had his moment lying to the stewards, which got him disqualified, which is something of a perhaps forgotten chapter in his career.
Not by me.
No, not by me either. But
and when we get to the eventual Hamilton rejectful career retrospective, we will be pounding on that.
And perhaps some other things I would like to bring up would be Sebastian Vettel and his incredible one-lap pace. The Chinese Grand Prix, he had issues throughout the whole of Saturday practice, meaning that the car was barely ready in time for the qualifying session. So while the team was fixing it, he would go up and do one lap and go back into the pits. And he got himself pole through doing one lap runs for the entirety of qualifying. And it's one of the best qualifying stints, so to speak, I've ever seen from anyone. I don't follow F1 as closely nowadays as I used to, but Vettel's real talent was always in his one lap pace, and the Chinese Grand Prix that year has to be up there with the all-time great qualifying performances.
To put it this way, before the 2009 season, Mark Webber was known as one of the best qualifiers in the sport. After 2009, he very much wasn't.
No, Vettel took that trophy from him. Two more things, and then I shall really genuinely stop coming up with more things to talk about. But when Alonso took pole in the Hungarian Grand Prix, he had a very low amount of fuel. It was basically a show run to get pole position. And then later on in the race, when he was running in third or fourth or whatever it is, as he dropped down the grid, his wheel fell off after coming out the pits. It was a bit dodgy, a bit wobbly, especially after, as aforementioned, Felipe Massa and Henry Surtees' accidents. And so the FIA came down very hard with a suspended penalty on Renault, effectively suspended, banning them from Valencia. And back in the day, because the FIA was known in some circles as Ferrari International Assistance, this was seen as a deliberate move to get Fernando Alonso into Felipe Massa's Ferrari. Which, I know we're talking about something which happened in the context of something very serious, but in hindsight now it is very funny to think that Fernando Alonso was basically being deliberately disqualified so that the FIA could wheel him into Felipe Massa's Ferrari seat. I wish Formula One was that exciting and that silly, but That's one happy and jolly thing I wanted to mention, and I guess we did mention it already, but the last thing I wanted to bring up was also the fact that 2009 was probably the first year with widespread radio comms being made public. We had in 2004, 2003 or so it began, with occasional specific drivers who had, so to speak, volunteered to have some of their broadcasts put public. Ferrari famously didn't. That's why you'll never hear a Schumacher radio comm before he joined Mercedes, for example. But
yeah, there was the 2001 after the championship, but I don't know whether they had actually made that live or whether they added that for, say, a post-season review. But
perhaps. But again, like this is a podcast. I don't have all my facts in order, perhaps. But 2009 was definitely the first season where it was entirely universal and entirely public, and that's where we got the real gems, whereby Rob Smedley called his driver Felipe Baby, for example, and it was a new era because people didn't know.
Have they gotten him the right visors by now?
people didn't know how Formula One drivers spoke to their engineers and vice versa, and this has led to so many speculations since then, quite rightly, of I wonder what people's opinions would be if they heard as much whining from Ayrton Senna as they do now from Lewis Hamilton, for example. And what the reputation of those old drivers would be if we could listen to those old team radios, which obviously have been lost to history. 2009 was the first season which that became a thing, and we got obviously the right visor nonsense and all that, but that's where it began, and that's how we got to where we are today in this incredibly intrusive world into Formula One, where we hear and see absolutely everything.
Yeah. Again, some would argue that isn't a positive because in some ways it undermines legendary battles. Like, take for example that famous 2014 fight between Vettel and Red Bull. Vettel and Red Bull too, but Vettel and Alonso at Silverstone, where they did have an epic clash, but also bitched up a storm on the team radio. But in the end, it is. Generally, I fully agree, more positive to have those insights, to have those conversations, to have the emotion of the moment, even if, again, it sometimes makes the drivers appear very whiny. So, yeah, it's certainly a very interesting part of 2009, one of the many interesting parts. I have two positive things I want to add because we are really running low on time here. One is...
Please do.
The 2009 European Grand Prix, we didn't talk about the Championship 5 for good reason. We did the whole Lennart is bitter about the 2009 World Championship in a different podcast. But regardless of what else happened in that season, I can still go back to that 2009 European Grand Prix, watch either the race itself or the Formula One music videos they put online back in those days. I wonder whether people remember those. And just be happy at one of my favorite all-time drivers winning that first Grand Prix in 5 years, nearly 5 years. And just have a jolly good time for a couple of minutes. And the second part is just the fact that despite, as you said, the racing wasn't always the best in 2009, there were still so many stories that we got hours of discussion on it. Again, we are cutting some parts short here. So, in many ways, if you have an appreciation for off-season drama or multi-season developments coming to fruition, 2009 is the season for you because it had so many stories. It had more stories in 1 year than I would imagine Formula One will have this entire decade. So, to be a bit extreme about things. And so it's just a very fascinating year. Again, the culmination of many things happening years before it, the setup for many things to come in Formula One history. And while itself not a particularly worthwhile season in terms of sports entertainment, it's a season worth in its historic value, a season which cannot be overestimated in terms of its impact in the sport's history. So, yeah, just a fascinating year in the best and worst ways possible.
Yeah, Basically, yeah. I mean, like, as you were speaking there, I just remembered one or two other things. Like, the Australian Grand Prix was the very first race ever ended under a safety car. That's nowadays very controversial in the year of our Lord 2023, where people are saying, no, there should never be a race ending behind a safety car. And back then, that was the new norm, so to speak, back 14 years ago. There's so many precedents that were set. 2009 could really be seen as one of the first real modern seasons that of how we see F1 nowadays.
If this podcast comes out after the 17th of June, you can also find a link in the description to the latest Gravel Trap, which deals with just that very issue.
Yeah, well, and we'll add to it later. Don't worry, we'll make it count. Yeah, it's also like the first season of the BBC, for example. Their very short-lived repurchase of the Formula One TV rights, and they had the red button. They had, like, as a British viewer, that was the first year where we had like wall-to-wall coverage, different camera angles, different commentary, yada yada. Like,
and we were introduced to the wonders of things being very crucial in Formula One.
Yes. Oh, we have to. How did we not mention Jonathan Ledyard, the true reject of the year for 2009? No. Gosh, Jonathan Ledyard deserves a podcast of his own, but
still better than David Croft.
No. But let's move on from Jonathan. I can't believe we didn't think of Jonathan Ledyard. I thought Kamui Kobayashi was a crime that we'd not mentioned him until now, but now I think about it, gosh. Jonathan Ledyard
proves me point about how we skipped a lot of stuff and how 2009 is just a story upon story upon story upon story wrapped in a number of very mediocre races.
Yes. And on that note, shall we end our very, 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 very long podcast?
Indeed we shall, but not before we have left you with a very important lesson. Where teammates are close, teammates collide.
They've both got to find them all going off. That's because of the conditions. They've all got to make sure that they get into trouble. There's a problem there. That's